For decades, the entire world just held its breath. You had two superpowers, armed with weapons that were almost beyond imagination, locked in this incredibly tense standoff. But what if all that tension had just snapped? Let's dive into a world that, thankfully, never actually happened.
You know, it's the ultimate what-if of the entire 20th century. This is the question that shaped global politics, tons of blockbuster movies, and frankly, the nightmares of millions of people. So, what would have actually happened if the missiles started flying?
So, you probably think the answer's pretty simple, right? Total annihilation. The end of the world as we know it. But here's the twist. At the very same time the public was fearing the absolute worst, there were people methodically planning for survival. And they weren't just hoping. They were arguing it was not only possible, but actually probable. And that's the real conflict here. The vision of total apocalypse versus the practical manual for survival.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this what if, we have to rewind and look at the reality of the Cold War. This wasn't just some political argument. It was a whole global infrastructure of destruction just sitting there, ready to be activated at a moment's notice.
Here's the setup. You've got two massive power blocks, each one led by a superpower. Both of them had thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons pointed right at each other. And both sides lived in this constant, gnawing fear that the other guy was going to push the button first. It was a terrifyingly fragile situation.
And the concept that kept this fragile peace? Well, it had probably the most fitting acronym in all of history. MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. The logic was, brutally simple. The only thing stopping you from launching a nuclear attack was the absolute 100% certainty that it would guarantee your own destruction too. It was, for all intents and purposes, a global suicide pact.
All right, let's start with the scenario we all know. The one that's been burned into our collective consciousness from movies and books. This is the vision of the world ending, not with a whimper, but with thousands of blinding, terrible flashes.
An all-out nuclear exchange would kick off with thousands of warheads hitting military sites in major cities. The immediate effects, they'd be truly apocalyptic. We're talking about entire cities just vaporized. Shockwaves would flatten buildings for miles around, followed by massive firestorms that would literally suck all the oxygen out of the air. And if you somehow survived that initial blast, well, a slower, invisible killer was waiting for you. Intense radiation.
And look at this. This really brings home just one part of the weapon's power. This isn't the blast wave. This is just the heat. The thermal pulse from a test explosion instantly cooked the paint right off this house. Now just try to imagine that kind of heat hitting every single flammable object in an entire city all at the same time.
But the thing is, the destruction wouldn't just stop at the blast zones. All those massive firestorms from hundreds of burning cities, they would pump just incredible amounts of soot and smoke way, way up into the atmosphere. That soot would create this dark shroud that would circle the entire globe. And that's where we get this terrifying concept known as nuclear winter.
And this is where things really spiral out of control. It's a domino effect. The soot blocks out the sun, which causes global temperatures to just crash. That triggers crop failures and famine on a worldwide scale. Ecosystems collapse, global trade grinds to a halt, and the human population plummets. It's a full-on crisis for the entire planet, not just the countries that were at war.
Okay, so that's the apocalypse version, but what if that isn't the whole story? While the rest of the world was imagining the end, civil defense researchers were busy working on a very different scenario. Their thinking was brutally pragmatic. If the unthinkable happens, the nation has to endure. This wasn't about preventing the war, it was about ensuring that government and society could continue after it.
This idea really comes into focus with a real-life manual called Nuclear War Survival Skills. And it directly challenges that whole idea of an unwinnable, unsurvivable war. The authors really believe that with the right knowledge and prep, survival wasn't some fantasy. It was a statistical likelihood for millions of people.
So how on earth were people supposed to survive something like this? Well, we're not talking about fancy, high-tech bunkers for the elite. This was more like a national resilience project. The goal was to empower ordinary citizens, people like you and me, with field-tested, practical knowledge to save themselves.
The whole thing centered around this concept of expedient equipment. Think of it as just DIY survivalism. The whole point was to create instructions for life-saving gear that anyone, and I mean anyone, could build in less than 2 days, just using stuff they could find in their garage or at a local hardware store.
So, after the initial blast, the biggest threat is radioactive fallout. So job number 1 is shelter.
Here, you can see a dead simple trench shelter that you could dig and cover with logs and dirt. It was designed to give you a radiation protection factor of 300. That's a huge deal. It means a person inside would get less than 1/300th of the radiation they'd get just standing out in the open. All right, next up, water. Critically important. The manual had these simple plans, like this one. For a plastic-lined pit you could dig to store water and keep it safe from fallout contamination. Again, look how simple this is. A shovel, a sheet of plastic, and you've solved a massive life-or-death problem.
And it gets even more detailed than that. Here, we have plans for a homemade fallout mask, designed to stop you from breathing in radioactive dust, which you really don't want to do. And get this, the instructions even suggest using the elastic waistband from a pair of men's undershorts. I mean, that's just how practical and down-to-earth this whole approach was.
And this wasn't just a collection of random tips, it was all part of a larger, incredibly methodical plan. This checklist gives you a sense of it. The advice wasn't just about building things, it was about thinking through the crisis logically. Get information, pack your tools, get your supplies. It's really an attempt to impose some kind of order on the ultimate chaos.
So, let's say it works. Millions of people actually survive. What kind of world would they inherit? Well, it sure as heck wouldn't be the one they left behind. The entire political and cultural map of the planet would be fundamentally, and probably brutally, rewritten.
And one of the big theories is that global power would do a complete 180. With the Northern Hemisphere just devastated, the new centers of the world could pop up in the global South. We're talking about countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Australia, places that, just because of their location, would have been largely spared from the direct attacks.
In this kind of world, the governments we know would probably fragment or go underground. You might even see more authoritarian regimes pop up just to maintain some kind of control. New borders would be drawn right through wastelands. The whole focus of human culture would shift away from growth and competition to just pure survival and rebuilding. And technology? It would hit a massive wall for decades, but it wouldn't disappear entirely, as survivors would salvage everything they possibly could.
So there you have it. Two starkly different visions of a nuclear future. On one side, a planet plunged into a dark, frozen winter. And on the other, resourceful survivors methodically rebuilding civilization right out of the ruins.
And what's so fascinating is what these two scenarios really reveal about us. It's this incredible duality, isn't it? On one hand, we created the means for our own total, complete annihilation. But on the other hand, we meticulously documented, tested, and planned for our own survival against those very same odds. Thankfully, that fuse was never lit. The Cold War stayed cold, and these scenarios remained hypothetical. But they're a powerful reminder of just how fragile peace really is, and how a few different choices, or even a few mistakes, could have changed absolutely everything. It forces us to ask a really fundamental question. Does our nature bend more toward building the ultimate weapon, or toward figuring out how to survive it?